Will you help me warmly welcome Robin Eckersley? Thanks, Robin.
Thank you very much, Don. My brief tonight is to address the justice implications of mainly the Copenhagen negotiations, which seem a long way removed from the national debate about carbon trading. So I will say a little bit about the general context in which the national debate is taking place. I've just come back from 6 months sabbatical study in Oxford, which gave me the opportunity to follow the UK debates, the Western European debates, and also keeping a close eye on the international debates. But a lot happened while I was away. And when I returned, I felt I was returning into some kind of time warp. Because during my period of absence, Tony Abbott replaced Malcolm Turnbull as the opposition leader and began a very powerful offensive against the Rudd government's carbon pollution reduction scheme, which was called a great big new tax on everything. Voters are increasingly confused about the intricacies of emissions trading, and a lot of householders who have invested in emissions trading technologies are worried that perhaps all their efforts are just creating more allowances for big polluters to use. The email leaks at the University of East Anglia and inaccurate science in the IPCC fourth assessment report on the rate of glacial melting has also set a new round of debates about the veracity of the climate change science. Developments in the US, the loss of Teddy Kennedy's hitherto safe Democrat seat of Massachusetts has reduced the Democrat majority in the Senate. So instead of 60 senators, they have 59. You need 60 to get over a filibuster motion and 67 Senate votes to ratify an international treaty. Mid-term congressional elections in the US are set to reduce the number of Democrats in the House and the Senate, which is not looking good for the passage of emissions trading legislation in the US. The price of permits under the EU ETS scheme are much lower than what they should be to bite and make the market do its job. And against all of this, Copenhagen has been widely reported to be a failure. Public support for the CPRS in Australia, according to a news poll conducted for The Australian last weekend, had it around 57%, dropping from 72% in October last year. So one would have to say on the strength of all of this that the future of emissions trading in Australia is uncertain, to say the least. So Australia is moving with its characteristic political caution, playing a wait-and-see game, seeing what will happen in the US. We have Obama visiting Australia shortly, so that's going to be interesting. Industry is now looking to refresh its policy in this particular area. Against this background, the Greens have put forward a proposal for an interim carbon tax so that we don't sit back and sit on our hands but actually have a price out there that will start to have industry start to invest in a more low-carbon future while we try and iron out some kind of emissions trading scheme in the life of this Parliament or possibly the subsequent Parliament. But my task is to sketch the broader backdrop here. So what I want to talk about is the justice implications of the international negotiations with some very brief reflections on what that might mean for Australia. Now, political scientists, political philosophers, when they talk about justice, like to single out different dimensions of justice. Most of us think of justice as distributive justice, who gets what, when and how. In the case of climate change, we are talking about here the distribution of the risks of climate change, and there's an inverse relationship between those who are most responsible and most capable of responding and those that are going to suffer the greatest impacts. So that's a monumental injustice in and of itself. There's also huge justice implications in determining the burdens of mitigation amongst 193 countries in the world, with considerable differences in levels of development. The Climate Change Treaty has justice principles called Common but Differentiated Responsibility, which pretty much explain this gap between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries, which are the developed countries and economies in transition on the one hand and developing countries on the other. And that's why, under the Kyoto Protocol, only the Annex 1 countries, which are the former group, have quantified emission reduction targets. The other aspect of justice, of course, is procedural justice, and that has to do with whether or not the rules of negotiating the climate treaty are fair, reasonable, and transparent. Some have commented that the UN negotiating process is fatally cumbersome, that we don't have the luxury of time on our hands, and that we need a more flexible type of negotiating process. And I'll come back to this point a little later, after we've looked at what happened at Copenhagen, to see whether there may be ways in which the way we go about negotiating a climate treaty internationally might be improved in ways that are still consistent with procedural justice. Because at the end of the day, a lot of people see a tension between justice and effectiveness, but in a sense I see them as rather inextricably combined. Because an ineffective treaty, that is one that does not prevent dangerous climate change, is going to cause massive injustices by unevenly distributing the biggest risks to those who are least responsible. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about what a fair carbon trading scheme might be, but certainly you want the widest possible covering of economic sectors and emissions. You want a fair and transparent allocation of permits, ideally through an auction. You want fair rules and consequences of trading. By all means, have some international linking, but you don't want too much linking if that's going to prevent innovation at home, and it can postpone innovation. And of course, you want compensatory measures for low-income folk who may not be able to afford rising electricity prices, about which we just heard a great deal. Now, the textbook arguments in favour of an emissions trading scheme compared to a carbon tax, I think, stack up as being more robust. But what we have designed in Canberra strays somewhat from the economic textbook, and the proposal for a carbon tax has been put forward at least as an interim measure. Both of these mechanisms put a price on carbon, which is what we want to drive changes in behaviour, changes in investment, particularly in renewables and low efficiency technologies, or improved efficiency technologies. The difference, of course, is one is a quantity instrument that leaves it to the market to set the price. The other is a price instrument that leaves it to the market to determine the quantity. So it's much easier with a cap and trade system to set your emission reductions trajectory and to reduce it on an annual basis to stay on track. It's harder to do that in relation to a price instrument because it depends on a whole range of other things, including elasticity of demand. A lot of people say a carbon tax is a lot simpler and not vulnerable to rent-seeking behaviour, but you'll see rent-seeking behaviour, cries for exemptions and so forth. A carbon trading system is much more amenable to international linking. It's much harder to have international harmonisation of tax. But for the moment, perhaps the Greens' proposal of a Plan B is a feasible interim economic measure at the moment. Okay, so now let's turn to Copenhagen and see what happened there. Now, as most of you are probably aware, the hope was that we would have a legal treaty, one that included the US, one that focused on long-term cooperative action to address climate change, that would limit warming to at least 2 degrees to prevent dangerous climate change. The IPCC, that's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, recommended that developed countries as a group collectively reduce their emissions by about -25% to -40%. China, the G77, said that should be at the upper range. Developed countries who are beginning to point the finger now at the major emerging emitters in the developing world are saying, you guys have to start doing a bit of heavy lifting too, not necessarily in the form of reducing your aggregate emissions, but at least reducing them from business as usual growth, in the form, in this case, of emissions intensity targets, which are targets that reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of GDP. So what that means is your rate of growth is reduced rather than your overall aggregate emissions reduced. Most of the future growth in emissions, of course, is coming from the developing world. So at Copenhagen, they were hoping to get a treaty that would have serious commitments. There was a whole lot of other elements to it, but I don't have time to go through adaptation, technology transfer, and those other issues. The EU, which traditionally has been the climate leader, put forward some basic scenarios which pretty much reiterate what I just said. You have a situation where developing countries are reducing their aggregate emissions by a certain amount, but a wedge of that can be achieved through the international carbon market. Whereas developing countries are reducing their rate of growth from a business-as-usual scenario to something less, but a wedge of that is being assisted through finance mechanisms such as the Clean Development Mechanism, which is one of the flexibility mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol. Just prior to Copenhagen, a lot of the countries came up with their pre-conference pledges. And so what I have there is a select group of countries, Annex 1 countries, showing what they were pledging before they came to Copenhagen in December last year. You will see that only Norway, within the European Union, their collective emission reduction target was minus 20%. Remember, the IPCC says minus 25 to 40%. China and the G77 say, we want you guys to cut by 40%. The EU said, we'll go you 20, but we'll raise it to 30 if there's a comparable commitment by non-EU developed countries. Norway, who's not a member of the EU, said, we'll go for minus 30. Japan, minus 20. Canada, minus 20. The US, minus 17. And Australia, a unilateral commitment to minus 5, rising to 25% if there's an agreement to stabilise emissions at 450 parts per million in the atmosphere. Notice, though, that that group at the bottom have a different baseline. The first group of countries are all reducing from a 1990 baseline, the bottom group from a much more recent baseline. So if you translate the minus 17% cut of the US to a 1990 baseline, that's about minus 4%. That's a long way from minus 40%. You have to multiply it by 10. The square brackets represent what was actually pledged after Copenhagen. That's where there's some changes, but most of the countries stayed on track with those pledges. Now, as far as the major emerging emitters in the developing world, China went from minus 40 to minus 45% emissions intensity target, India minus 20 to 25, and Brazil, as far as I'm aware, the only developing country that went for an aggregate emission reduction target of up to 39%, or around between 37 and 39%. Okay, so what actually happened at Copenhagen? Well, what we saw was a political agreement, not a legal agreement, a legally binding treaty, simply a political agreement. The Danish text that had been prepared for negotiation was a sea of brackets. By that I mean, in those brackets were parts of the negotiating text about which there was no agreement. This political agreement was not endorsed at the end of the conference, it was noted. So it has uncertain status. Mind you, a vast majority of the states present did support it, and that those holding out numbered less than 10, but the rules of procedure for negotiating treaties under the UNFCCC framework is voting. Not voting, but by consensus. There are provisions to enact rules for a majority vote, but you need consensus to agree on what those rules are, and there's so far, throughout the nearly 20-year history of the UNFCCC, no agreement on what those voting rules should be. So everything has to grind along slowly according to consensus. The Accord had very few numbers in it, very few numbers. It mentioned 2 degrees, acknowledging that to be the scientific recommendation. It even mentioned 1.5 degrees a little later, but they were about the only numbers that occurred or that were noticeable in this particular agreement. What they did say was that the Annex 1 countries would post their quantified emission reduction targets in a schedule to this agreement by the 31st of January this year, and the developing countries would post their nationally appropriate measures by the same date. And this is the language set down in the Bali Action Plan back in the COP back in 2007 in Indonesia, where they negotiated a roadmap for negotiating this treaty, which is still very much underway. The very poor countries only had to undertake voluntary actions. Okay, so the bad news, and there was, I'm afraid, quite a bit of bad news. There was no agreement on 2020 targets or 2050 targets of a generalised principles nature. No putting into effect of the idea of common but differentiated responsibility in a way that could be applied systematically to the developed world or indeed to the developing world to enable them to graduate to Annex 1 in the future, or to start taking on emission reduction targets according to a principled formula. That didn't happen. There were no emissions intensity targets for developing countries, no timetable for the peaking of global emissions, no push for expanded carbon markets, uncertainty about the future status of the clean development mechanism, and consequently business uncertainty, no procedures for ratcheting up the commitments made by countries on the basis of the evolving science. But nonetheless, 55 countries out of 193 responded to the deadline by posting information on the UNFCCC website. I checked today and there are now 69 countries that have put data up there. So most countries did stick to their pre-COP15 pledges. But the really bad news is that if you add this up, the pledges don't go anywhere near addressing the problem. It's about half of what's required to limit global warming to 2 degrees. Okay, so let's look at some of the dynamics of the negotiation. And the geometry of the negotiations changed quite significantly with the concerted re-engagement in the climate multilateralism on the part of the US, which had disengaged under the previous administration of George Bush Jr. So the G2 were locked in fairly serious discussions, particularly during the high-level segment at the end of the conference. In fact, it was the G2 along with a new group called the BASICs, which is basically Mexico, South Africa, India and China. So in this case, the US and the BASIC group. The US had got hold of one of the many versions of the Danish texts and simplified it and worked over it with the BASIC group, and that was the text that emerged as the Copenhagen Accord. It was then presented to some of the larger OECD countries and then presented to the plenary on the final day where they couldn't agree on endorsement. They merely noted it. What's really interesting about the dynamics is the EU, which has traditionally been the climate leader, was in many ways eclipsed by the negotiations between the G2 and between the US and the BASIC group, who were the new guys, the new kids on the block, the new big players. And despite a change of administration, despite a commitment, a declared commitment by Barack Obama to make this climate change one of the priorities of his administration, there still is a very long-standing view of the US, which basically remains unaltered, that the division between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries is unhelpful and indeed unfair, that the major emerging emitters in the developing world should be made to do more in the same time commitment period, and that most of the focus should be on future growth in emissions, conveniently remaining silent about the question of historical responsibility for the cumulative emissions in the atmosphere and for gross differences in per capita carbon footprint. These things America is very quiet about, even under the current administration. And in many ways, I think a statement by Todd Stern, which is the US's special climate envoy at Copenhagen, summed it up. It's about math. We say maths, of course, but the Americans say math. It's about math, not morality. It's about future growth and how we limit that, sidelining a whole lot of issues that are absolutely crucial and burning to developing countries who say, it's about morality and development needs and not just maths. And this, if you had to have a division, and we're looking at this from the point of view of justice, this is a core division where you'll see the G77 and some of its subgroupings like the Association of Small Island States, the African Group, and all heavily backed by environmental NGOs saying it is about morality, not just maths, and it's about gross discrepancies in development needs. It's about ensuring that developing countries are given a little bit more of the atmosphere space to grow, to reduce this huge gap in development. Activists, of course, were locked out for most of the second week in the cold. It was very cold, snowing. Part of the reason was because the Bella Centre had a capacity of around 15,000 and there are about 40,000. So there was a problem there, but I think there were only 4 fire exits, which created some issues of safeties, which meant they admitted a lot less folk in the last week. So in the past, they'd always had considerable access to negotiations, quite a degree of input, some of them even playing a little bit of useful shuttle diplomacy that serves as a lubricant between groups which otherwise might have rather hardened perspectives. So that was something that was a great disappointment to many of the observers present. Okay, so the broader implications are that we now have the G2 and the BASIC group as fairly key players, and the EU sidelined. You had a very unusual situation towards the end of the negotiations where the German leader Angela Merkel was pleading with Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao, please let us have targets. Please let us commit to 2020 targets and 2050 targets, because it was China that is reputedly responsible for taking out most of the numbers in the Copenhagen Accord, which many observers find mystifying. Why that might be so, we can only speculate. Possibly it sees itself as a developed country by 2020 and would therefore be bound and doesn't wish to be bound. A more Machiavellian interpretation would be that it's really wanting to win the green tech race, and this strict regulation earlier on the part of OECD countries might spawn that competition and not give China a leading edge. I've heard all sorts of Machiavellian arguments, but ultimately it's a bit of a mystery, given that they're more likely to be hit by climate change in a more serious way than most developed countries. Environmental NGOs are bitterly disappointed at having been locked out for most of the second week. But more broadly, and I want to finish with some observations on this topic, there is now an idea that circulating that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiating process is not up to the job. To have 193 countries have to reach agreement by consensus in a period of roughly 2 weeks is impossible, given the complexities of the negotiation. Certainly this is a view that's growing in some quarters in the US, that you need to have a different, more flexible process, perhaps move it to the G20 or the Major Economies Forum, for example. Or just focus on the top 20 polluters, where you really do need reductions. You don't even need to engage a lot of least developed countries at the moment, so this argument runs. But if we go back to those two core dimensions of justice that I raised with you at the beginning, distributive justice and procedural justice, you'd have to ask, where is the justice in a negotiating process that confines it to the polluters and locks out the victims? Where is the justice in that? If you don't have groups like IASIS or the African group and others at the table, then a lot of their interests are likely to go unheard. That said, we certainly do need a more flexible negotiating process. A lot of people are saying this is now like the Doha development round, grinding along slowly, producing very little. There are a lot of interesting ideas coming out of the WTO at the moment, or observers, academics and so forth, saying that what we need is perhaps plurilateral agreements, that is, agreements made by not multilateral but plurilateral by a plural group of states which those that aren't party to it don't have to join but can later join. That way you can move forward more effectively. Maybe a concentric circles approach where you have major emitters with major regional groupings of developing countries present, negotiating something in a more flexible manner, which is then brought back to a larger group. We can maybe draw lessons here from the failure of the Treaty of Versailles back in 1919 and the failed League of Nations, where the US was largely responsible for creating this beast and then walking away from it subsequently. Whereas the UN was more effective because it acknowledged geopolitics, acknowledged the great powers, and it gave them a veto in the Security Council. Maybe some type of lessons might be learned there, acknowledging the role of the major emitters, but in ways where you have maybe a rotating group of the victims also at the table. These are just some ideas that could be floated. But I think that news of the death of the climate negotiating process, to borrow Mark Twain's famous saying, is grossly exaggerated. It's been going now for about 20 years because the intergovernmental negotiating process began in around 1999. So in fact, it's been going for 21 years. It's developed some very robust distributive justice principles that acknowledge differences in capacity and responsibility. It's just they haven't been operationalised properly or applied in a principled and systematic way. There's been a refinement of flexibility mechanisms and a lot of development on compliance and so forth under the Kyoto Protocol. All of that painstaking work should not be thrown out the window. It's fine if these issues also migrate to these other fora, like the G20 and, for example, the Major Economies Forum, if they're complementary and mutually reinforcing fora which build on the develop new initiatives that aid fundamental objectives of the climate change treaty. But I think it needs to be continually worked upon. Part of that is through very clever choice of the chair. A lot of people are comparing the chairing role of Estrada at the Kyoto negotiations in 1997 with the Danish chairing, which wasn't quite as effective. The use of contact groups and friends of the chairs can often cut out some parties in the discussions, and therefore they don't feel the negotiations are fair, and therefore the outcomes aren't legitimate. So there needs to be a lot of effort in the lead up to the Mexico COP at the end of this year into questions of process so we can move the negotiations along. But to finish on the note of justice, which is my brief, or focus, before I get to that, I think the economic context is such that whatever policy initiatives are ultimately taken in this country, we need to get some price on carbon. We need to get economic incentives that will actually get new investment happening. And I'm prepared to remain agnostic as to how we do that. We certainly need a better designed emission trading scheme, one that has less loopholes in it than the current one. But above all, we need very strong targets and a clear emissions reduction strategy. Copenhagen showed us that we desperately need climate leadership and exemplary action on the part of developed countries in particular to pave the way for the developing world to follow along in our footsteps and to leapfrog over the mistakes we've made in the past, often unwittingly. Australia, as has been mentioned, is the highest per capita emitter, and although a lot of politicians say that our aggregate emissions aren't great, most countries in the world can say that. Australia is still in the top 20 league of aggregate emitters, highest per capita and top 20 league of aggregate emitters. So we can't afford not to consider our moral responsibilities. So I guess my take-home message is that we need to embrace our moral responsibilities rather than do what we seem to want to do in the past, which is play follow the leader. Thank you.